What are Man Seders? What are they about? And what does that have to do with drinking? And that's something we're going to explore on this episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest of the show, Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky. Welcome.
Thanks so much. Pleasure to be here.
My absolute pleasure. All right, so for those less familiar with Rabbi Dr. Sinensky here, he is many things. He is director of the Lamm Heritage Archives and editor at the Lehrhaus, director of Judaics and upper school principal at Mainline Classical Academy in suburban Philadelphia. But that's not all. He wrote his dissertation on rabbinic conceptions of masculinity. Lo Yilbash is a case study in Halakhic Conceptions of Masculinity and is currently a fellow in the inaugural cohort of Sachs Scholars, and I feel exhausted just hearing about that. So that's a lot.
Definitely keeping busy.
That's great. So your dissertation obviously has some resemblance to, talking about masculinity. I'm really curious about your dissertation, and I know you sent it to me. We're talking about Man Seders, right? This phenomenon. How did you write about this Man Seders thing? I know it was an essay. Anybody can click in the show notes about the Man Seders thing, but was that connected to your dissertation in any way?
Yeah, great question. For sure. It's really interesting. Initially, when I started working on my dissertation, I said to the professors, I'm really interested in doing something at the intersection between Jewish thought and/or halakha and something having to do with gender. I started reading just tons of material on feminism, etc., and it became very clear very quickly that not many people out there wanted to hear very much on my perspectives as a man on women's experience and so on. I decided that might not be the most
but what about men's experiences?
Way to go. So that I felt a little bit more qualified.
You have an inside track. Okay.
So some legitimacy, some at least personal perspective that I might have to share. So I ended up writing on something that's specific to masculinity and really thinking about that topic, but of course, writing an academic dissertation, I had the great joy, but also joy that comes with some limitations of kind of sticking to more academic content, material, etc. And of course, if you're trying to wear lots of hats and finish a dissertation at the same time, made a lot of good sense to kind of bracket and to say, all right now I'm focused on kind of the academic content and material. It gives me a foundation. All that's good. All that's really valuable. Let me complete this body of work. And then in the back of my mind, I kind of collected some material topics that were of interest to me, some of which I've gone to, some of which I'd like to get to, which are a little bit more practical, kind of a little bit more relevant to our everyday lives, and wouldn't necessarily make their way directly into a dissertation. Just wouldn't be the right place to address those topics, but obviously kind of emerge in a more general way after, out of some good thinking about the topic of masculinity and the Jewish community.
By the way, I just took a peek at the whole table of contents, and it's a lot. Some people focus, especially if they're doing your type of work, on just rabbinic stuff, just Chazal. But anybody interested, it is available online. Not only the rabbinic stuff, but other ancient Near East, I'm sorry, not ancient, late antiquity, medieval authorities, and beyond. So there's a lot there. It's like a survey, a historical survey, kind of.
It really is a historical survey, and that was the one that I really wanted to write. And I kind of had to convince my professors who were totally on board, but wanted to hear a compelling case that this could be done successfully. As you say, this is not the way it's usually done in the academy today. Usually, it's kind of like a very, very narrow focus, a very specific time period, and it makes good sense because it's easy to generalize around, about all sorts of different periods in history, in halakha, etc., and to make lots of mistakes. So I had to have different advisors with expertise at different moments in history kind of examine the manuscript and kind of look at it and to check it. But it was really the blessing ultimately of yeshiva education, where we weren't limited to just one epoch in history. Now there are, of course, potential dangers or downsides to looking too broadly, right? That we know as well, but without that grounding, I don't think I would have had the guts to the coolness to be that audacious. That was
it's a lot. Cool. It's a lot to bite off and to chew. So
it's a lot of fun, and for people to judge it by its merits.
Your curiosity, masculinity. I know you mentioned about wanting to do a dissertation on sort of gender and the masculinity piece. So what generated your interest, which will lead us into our topic?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It was really a combination of two things. So, as I mentioned, I was thinking about gender in general, and that really ultimately emerged from this kind of abiding sense that I've gotten from my students, that there are so many questions and there's so many ideas and so much confusion around these topics,
Mm.
and really not all that much work that's being done to address it directly. It's just really thinking about how do we become, you can talk and talk about the Jewish perspective on gender, but if we don't understand kind of the ideas that are out there today as well, kind of what are kind of the undercurrents of kind of the zeitgeist today, and that's ultimately what our children are getting, what our students are getting. That's ultimately kind of the air that they're breathing. So I thought it was really important to be exposed to that, but at the same time to kind of check it and balance it with Jewish sources as well. So that was one piece, kind of from that educators and personal curiosity standpoint. That was one. And then the masculinity piece was like really this awareness in the sense that like we were at this really complicated and interesting moment where on the one hand there's been so much discourse and so much done, but so much more that needs to be done in terms of providing more opportunities for women in general society, in the Jewish community in particular. All these issues that of course are incredibly important that we think and talk about, but that at the same time there's this kind of just now an awareness of this kind of crisis of masculinity in the general society and perhaps in our community as well. Even on even on a religious basis, outside of very specific faith communities, overwhelmingly more women are affiliated with religious communities today outside of Orthodox Judaism and Islam, actually. It's actually fascinating that in ritual roles, women have a significantly higher percentage of engagement and involvement. You can imagine why in the Orthodox Jewish community that might not be the case. So that's a conversation for another time. But there is this sense that boys are struggling more with violence, with drugs. We know this from experience. Boys developmentally are about 1.5 to 2 years behind their female counterparts. So you've got a ninth grader in a co-ed class. The ninth grade boy has approximately the developmental level of a 7.5 grade girl. And yet they're in the same classroom. You can imagine what happens, right? You don't have to be a social scientist to recognize that can set our boys back. And there's a tremendous amount of fascinating work that's being done on that as well. So this question of masculinity and kind of the, how do we balance between the recognition that there are significant challenges for both genders in very different ways without equating between them at all, but that we ought not, miss, certain significant communal challenges that we're facing today, because other ones are present and important as well, and to kind of balance both at the same time. As a man, that was especially important to me. And that does connect to the Man Seders, because this question of kind of how we engage our children and how we engage our adults obviously emerges from that crisis of masculinity.
Great segue, because now I'm curious. So there are probably a lot of listeners who've never heard of them, don't know what they are, because they're a rather recent phenomenon. Obviously, they didn't start with COVID or in the immediate aftermath. I was hearing about them years ago, but they couldn't have started, more than 10, 15 years ago?
Well, it's interesting. I think they became especially popular in the Orthodox community in particular. I'd say that's right, maybe 10, 15 years ago, within less than 15 years. But they did exist previously on a much smaller basis.
Oh, really?
Within the Orthodox community. Before that, probably in the Reform community, interestingly enough.
Oh, really?
Yeah, if you go back to probably as early as the late 80s or early 90s, you have Reform Man Seders, called by different names, this sort of thing. Probably a response to women's Seders that happened and were emerging as well. And so, while I'm not a historian of this, it's kind of been suggested that first in the, certainly outside of the Orthodox community, and then ultimately in the Orthodox community later on, there were women's Seders, and we know that there are kind of feminist symbols that some people have at Seders, things like that. But then, especially in the non-Orthodox community, there was this earlier awareness of this crisis. Right? Like the early discussions of wait a second. So now if we've allowed women to become ordained and so on and so forth, so many wonderful opportunities for women to become involved and engaged in the community in a variety of ways. And then men were emptying from the pews.
Mm.
And so there's this crisis. And so there was this literally a crisis of masculinity or of just men's involvement.
Or just the role for men to be involved in Jewish life, or at least in this specific piece of Jewish life.
Yeah, there was this sense of there was pride in the new opportunities that were being made available to women at all levels of synagogue life. But then there was this kind of later awareness. Wait a second, where are all the men disappearing? It's like all the presidents. We're all women. It's like as an Orthodox Jew who grew up Orthodox, like it might sound strange, it's like the struggles of like women occupying, even the role of president in a synagogue has been controversial and remains controversial. Certainly in certain parts of the Orthodox community. Move over to the right, of course, as you know.
Hey there! I hope you're enjoying this episode so far with Rabbi Dr. Sinensky. I want to give you a sneak peek into next week's episode featuring a couple talking about creating a brand, importing, and so much more. Here we go.
The main challenge is breaking into the other states, because then you either have a license in other states or you do what most of distributors do. They use other distributors in other states, but that is extremely hard to do. To get on another distributor's portfolio is extremely challenging when you have a small portfolio. Today, it's the other way around. Today, people reach out to us and they're like, oh, we have stores that are looking for your wine. We have stores that are looking for your spirits. Can we be your distributor? But at the beginning, it was us calling and begging people, hey, can you take our stuff? I know there's one store or two that wants us. It's very different when you have items that are actually popular.
I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into next week's episode. Now back into this episode with Rabbi Dr. Sinensky. I know you said you're not an historian of these, yet you probably, who is? You probably, already sharing with, clearly you've seen, I didn't even think about it as a response to the women's Seders, which probably popped up 70s, 80s, maybe 60s?
I think probably late 70s, early 80s.
And so you're suggesting maybe these popped out of reform in response to the women's Seders to provide something also for the men. And I realized we didn't actually describe what they are. So they are a pre-Passover prep opportunity event, right? Of some sort, whatever they are, maybe actually of a Seder or modeling a Seder to get people ready.
Yeah, I think that's
okay. Well, I say that because I've seen different models contemporaneously, which are not all the same, which at least the men's ones seem to be different all over.
I think it's really interesting. I think, I'm not certain. My sense is that the reform ones tend to be more of kind of like an actual model Seder, kind of like what you defined, a model Seder at school or the like.
Right, which it sounds like it's filling a different need. Whereas maybe people who are more familiar, whether with the Hebrew or with the running of a Seder, they don't need that aspect. They don't need how to run it. But maybe people less familiar would be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think if you look at the exactly what you said, the different models, even within the Orthodox community of the Man Seder, I think it probably is fair to say that it tracks onto exactly this question. So the men who are less familiar with the Seder it'll kind of be a focus on, okay, it's assumed, or I want to at least acquire the skills to be able to lead my Seder or to be one of the leaders of my Seder. I really don't know how. So the synagogue will create an opportunity for kind of this social camaraderie, but around kind of the mechanics of the Seder, maybe a couple of ideas to share at the Seder. But fundamentally, it's about how do I lead my Seder with competency and therefore with confidence.
So clearly there's a variety. I know locally the one that happens in Cincinnati is more Divrei Torah for inspiration for anybody involved with the Seder, maybe also for those running. So now it sounds like there's a variety out there of both this model that I've experienced and maybe, or who knows, maybe there could be how-to pieces or best practices that people can throw into their Sedarim.
Yeah, I've seen kind of and spoken to rabbis who do some combination of all these. I think it's a spectrum.
But by the way, it is really fascinating. Just when we think that everything has been documented, there's so much written about all the different Jewish things happening. Yet, so I had a previous episode where we had Dr. Michal Shaul of Herzog College talk about Kiddush clubs. and that she wrote an article which really was the absolute first academic article on but even so, very scant has ever been written about them in general. They happen to be a little bit more off the beaten path than maybe these sorts of things. But even she shared even kiddushes, just the very public, very common synagogue public kiddushes. No one's written on, or even a history of them. When did they start? Were they a 19th century phenomenon? Or are they much more recent? So even these things that are just, we are very commonly accustomed to in Jewish life, yet people haven't written on them or documented about them.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We are, as much as we're people's book, first of all, we're people who often study older books. I think that's one piece of that. That's one, even if they now appear on wonderful online interfaces, but nonetheless, classical books. And we're also just a small community. Right? How large is modern Orthodoxy, or how large are, and how many sociologists of contemporary Orthodoxy are there in the world? How many hands can you count them on? So
so that's, I'm saying, yes, for Man Seders, Kiddush clubs, I get that it's super tiny, but even kiddushes, that is not something that modern Orthodoxy has a monopoly on. So just even in whether American Jewish life or Jewish life more broadly, public kiddushes or Saturday I don't know. Once she said that, I got deeply curious about this. Yeah. So, but has there been anything written on? I imagine not, or even just documentation. Has anybody collected this stuff?
I haven't seen anything formal. I did speak to a wide range of people. It looked certainly for academic articles. I didn't, look at everything everywhere, nor did I seek to write one myself. So it wasn't necessary as part of the research, but I didn't come across anything. Yeah. And there's, you're right. There's work to be done.
Yeah. So another thing I just realized while we're chatting was about one of the differences with the Reform, whether the women's Seders or the corresponding men's Seders. I know a lot of Reform don't necessarily do it the night of Passover or the nights of Seder, and they're happy to celebrate holidays different times whenever it works out for family members. So maybe they felt that they could this accomplish their Seder needs. I don't know, but whereas I think definitely for Orthodox, it is what it is, and so to have something like this has to be a separate night, specifically in preparation and not actually of the Seder itself.
I think that's right, but my sense, though, still is that even the Reform ones that we're referring to, the women's Seders, the men's Seders, didn't necessarily replace the family ones.
More preparatory.
They're preparatory, but I think what's interesting about the women's Seders in particular is that it's also kind of an opportunity for women's fraternity to celebrate the Seder. But also but ideological also. In other words, when we're together with their family, there's a way in which that kind of that women's but that kind of women's sense of camaraderie and community, which is so important to second wave feminism in particular. That it became an important kind of second Seder, as it were, or first Seder, right? Because it was beforehand, but it was sort of it was almost like a different kind of Seder that, colored theirs, but ultimately something they couldn't do together with their entire family at a traditional Seder.
So these Man Seders, have, from the Reform ones you mentioned, sort of filling that need for the men in the 80s. So these, I don't know where to go historically from there. I don't know what have you seen? Or is it really just more in this, at least particular expression of it, more or less 10, 15 years?
Yeah, I don't want to say that they've only existed the last 10, 15 years. In fact, there's one rabbi, Reuven Spolter. He reached out to me, and someone else pointed out that he confirmed, I don't know exactly the year, before he made Aliyah, he was a rabbi at, I believe, is the Young Israel of Oak Park. I think it's called the Young Israel. I'm sure it's in Oak Park, Michigan, which incidentally is of interest to me. My maternal grandparents actually lived there for for much of their lives, and actually was in Oak Park, although they're Chabadnikim, so we daven at the Chabad there, but be that as it may, so it's a personal connection. And he confirmed that he ran one, and he said he didn't hear the idea from anyone else, it was his own idea. I didn't ask him exactly which year, but I'm thinking this probably, I don't know, early 2000s or something like that. So a little bit longer, maybe 20 years ago, maybe even 25, I'm not sure exactly, but they did exist, you know, in the Orthodox community clearly, whether they emerged from you know, from other parts of the Jewish community.
Just in the air.
Browse in the air kind of thing. You know, it's kind of like when historians study these things, you're like, is this direct Christian influence, or is it just kind of like, you know, it's kind of, we're breathing the same air, whatever.
Yeah, well, clearly there was a need for it.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think, you know, the need might have been somewhat different in the Orthodox community, but there is an overlap, and I think especially in the men's seders, right? In other words, the women's seders were more kind of ideological in terms of, you know, as a feminist, and this is not, the men's seders are not meant to be anti-feminist. That's not how in any denomination of anyone that we've really spoken to, but rather kind of meeting either an educational need, as we spoke about, kind of like, you know, achieving competency and understanding the seder. Or a social need. That's a really, you know, important piece of it.
Absolutely. So I'm really curious by something you said, which is, so Rabbi Reuven Spolzer reached out to you. Have you, since you published that essay, have many people been reaching out to you about that?
I heard a couple of interesting just comments and responses, although nothing that was kind of completely novel or completely different. I heard a couple of interesting things. One was a mono-Orthodox rabbi who ran Man Seders pre-pandemic. He mentioned really interesting pieces of it. One was that they combined this with these kind of tzedakah chesed projects that people will bring in clothing or other old, you know, items to be donated pre-Passover, you know, to the community. It's a really nice piece. Like there's a sense of social activism around it. That was one. Another one was really interesting. Is from the same rabbi. He said that it was actually somewhat controversial in his shul.
I'm very curious now.
He got pushback and said, you know, like, what are you doing running this Man Seder? Why are you excluding the women from participating in this opportunity? You know, don't women, you know, are you running a women's Seder this year? Why are you running a men's Seder? Why are you not running a women's Seder? You know, why does that imply that there's some, you know, distinction among the genders? Everything else that we do in our shul is co-ed, and all of a sudden you're running this single gender program. It's just kind of odd, sticks out like a sore thumb. He said it got a lot of pressure. He didn't stop it, but he stopped and thought. That was kind of a really interesting piece.
Yeah. I realize we haven't really described, aside from a brief description of programmatically what's involved, whether some sort of Seder prep, Seder inspiration, how-tos, but there's also the consumptive aspects, which brings us to the Jewish drinking show. Obviously, there is drinking involved, but not just drinking and eating. Obviously, we think of the Seder, we think 4 cups of wine, but wine is typically not present at these Man Seders. It's more probably beer, bourbon, and barbecue, right?
Yeah, hardcore.
So it's drinks, it's meat, and
it's guys. Like, right, if we're talking
it's guy
about
time.
Yeah, if you're thinking about like masculinity,
yeah,
you know, it's like, now it's not like, you know, it's not, some people might say like, you know, eating steaks and beer, like, oh, that's toxic masculinity already, and like, you know, shalom, goodbye, and done. But like, you know, I don't know if I would see it that way necessarily, but they certainly, the people running the program and participating in the program don't necessarily see it that way. Kind of like a guy's night
out. Although I forgot, also some involve like cigars or pipes. Probably there's some smoking sometimes.
I have seen that.
That's probably in the minority, right?
It's minority, and one program that I know included that definitely did not include that in the advertising.
So it happened, but they didn't advertise it.
Yeah, now I don't know if it was planned or not, right?
It was spontaneous.
Right.
Okay.
We'll be over here doing more guys things. Rabbi, this is like, you know, just part of it, you know. An extended organic part of the Guys Night Out program. Yeah, but the Guys Night Out is actually, I've seen that as part of the advertising, actually.
Oh,
really
cool.
Interesting. It's like sort of like Man Seder and Men's Night Out. You know, we're like Guys Night Out, or Man Seder with pictures of like hunks of meats and
Mhm.
like schnapps galore. Like
Yes.
there's no picture of like the Haggadah. There's no picture. As you said, like 4 cups of wine. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
that,
Yep.
well, that will have it to Seder. That's fine. It's not what we came here for. That's yeah, it's like really just kind of direct.
Yeah. I mean, but this all really speaks to a need. I don't know, a need maybe. I mean, it does remind me to some degree about Kiddush clubs. Of yes, we can. Some Kiddush clubs have women join them, but but usually it's an opportunity for just a men's space only, even for a brief time. Drinking is also involved. But what is there about this need for? And also really quickly, I'm just gonna So what is there to say about, I don't know, filling that need, that role? Fulfilling those spiritual needs.
Yeah, well, I think we can debate and discuss spiritual, not
Okay.
spiritual. Like, I think that that's a really interesting question.
Or
I
maybe
think
not.
that,
Maybe it's just a social need.
yeah, and I think that's and I think that's actually one of the healthiest part of the American synagogue model. Actually, is one that I'm a very big fan of. Is the social dimension. In other words, it runs into danger, obviously, right? When you have social orthodoxy, and that's all that we're doing, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also true that one of the greatest gifts that tight-knit religious communities give their community members is the gift of belonging, is the gift of community, and to do that in a mindful, kind of really intentional way, I think is just forwarding the mission of a community-based and oriented synagogue. I think that that's really really important, and especially for guys.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I say that, I think it's critical for their. I'm a big fan. In the case, for just to go back to that story with the rabbi whose congregants kind of pushed back, and said, co-ed, there are plenty of kiddushes generally co-ed in most, in most, certainly in our community, obviously there are going to be spaces that are not, but, I don't have any issues with co-ed, adult programming and so on and so forth. But I think that there's a critical need for women's only programs, a critical need for men's only programming. I think there's a tremendous amount of research backing this up. Now, what's really interesting is also that what the research shows, I think I mentioned this in passing in my articles, that women and men at least tend overall to be interested in slightly different kinds of events. In other words, women will be very comfortable doing something or just being together, right? Like, we're just going to spend time together. Sometimes we'll do something, but that's not a prerequisite for most women to feel comfortable. What's really interesting is that the research shows is that more men, and we can argue whether this is good or not. We can argue whether this is, a negative function of masculinity or just kind of normal. We can argue about whether all men should be put into this box. I think they shouldn't. But men generally tend to do better when they're doing something side by side, which is really interesting. On the one hand, that means is that men are less likely to be encouraged to kind of talk face to face and heart to heart. And that can be, I think, a danger of just doing kind of like a program that doesn't kind of go deep, right? But at the same time, there's also a need for men to just kind of have a good time together, and that's okay too. So, I think it's really, really interesting is that these men Seders are not men talking about men's issues together. There might be a tremendous need for that. Not all men are comfortable with that. I think it's important to encourage more men. Not all men necessarily be comfortable for that. I don't think there's an obligation for all men to be, comfortable in that space. But I think that, both are important. This clearly falls on the side of the doing things together that are lots of fun, hanging, being in all those kinds of things. I think building that men's only kind of camaraderie, fraternity here in the unsafer ground, I think it's a really, really important part of the social fabric of the synagogue.
Hey there, I want to break in yet again. Although I asked for support in financial ways because it does cost some money to make the hosting happen and other aspects of Jewish drinking happen. So your financial support is definitely appreciated. And don't forget, you can go to jewishdrinking.com/donate. But also, another way of supporting the show and everything that Jewish Drinking does is also to tell your friends, tell your neighbors. If you like this content, if you like this show, maybe people you know also like it. So feel free to let them know, hey, I have this interesting episode I heard, or a few episodes, or whatever it is, or even a few clips. Feel free to share with your friends. All right. Thank you so much. Now back into the show. So I know we keep talking way back, but last 10, 15 years, it's growing. Probably in the last pre-COVID, like 5-10 years, it started really growing. Obviously, COVID put a stop to that, at least for 2020, maybe even 2021, but it's back. Have you, I suspect that it's back and real big. I imagine I'm guessing, I really don't know. I don't have any of the facts or data. Has it really exploded since then?
So I don't know if it's exploded since then. I think there's a mix. There's some of the communities that picked it back up. Some of them have not necessarily picked it back up. But I think that's true of most programming in the shuls that was kind of more auxiliary programming, right? So in other words, the kid, right? Most, Kiddush in general is back, but even in some shuls, really interesting. Some shuls, Kiddush is exactly what it was before the pandemic. Yeah. In some places, it's really not quite there. I think it'll get there. I think it will get there. I've certainly been to shuls and know of a number of shuls where it's just, part of it is just that the numbers are still not where they were.
You're saying for general synagogue engagement and attendance, it's not rebounded?
I haven't looked at the data. I don't think it's back 100%. I suspect that women's attendance is lower, from a percentage standpoint than men's relative to before the pandemic. I don't have data to confirm that. It's just anecdotal and suspicion, but
there's opportunities for research here that people could be exploring.
Please don't add this to my plate.
I'm just saying, I'm throwing it out into the ether. It doesn't have to be you. It could be just someone. If anybody's really struggling for research ideas, these are fantastic.
These are.
The one thing you wrote in your essay is, will men begin to feel displaced even in Orthodox settings as they feel in many liberal spaces? So I'm curious about that line. What have you seen or heard with regards to this concern?
Really interesting. So there's a big part of me that was, very much inclined to the position that even though there are very significant structural and cultural differences between, let's say, non-Orthodox, and again, of course, we know when we use that term, we're using it in a very broad sense, and we're kind of painting lots of different communities that are, with one very broad brush. And maybe here we need to do some division into, some segmenting of the community. But I thought that there'd be at least be a significant part of the community that where the men would feel some of the disenfranchisement and less, lack of engagement we're seeing in the non-Orthodox community. And I think we're finding maybe some of it. I don't know. I'm myself am admittedly kind of confused and conflicted about it. And part of it is just haven't studied the data, but I'll share with you some of the things that I've observed and seen.
Yes.
So here's one. There's a recent study that was performed by the OU, and there's some other data that seems to support it, that suggests that men are dropping out of, or dropping their affiliation with the modern Orthodox commundy at a higher rate than women.
So they're just pulling out of Jewish life, or specific, what does that mean?
So I don't want to use these terms off the derech or whatever, because mean a lot of different things and isn't necessarily most useful or fair sometimes terminology. But with the overlap between some non-Orthodox spaces and institutions like Hadar and others, and independent minyanim and these sorts of things, and college campuses, you have this happening, these sorts of phenomenon. But aside from that, I don't think that's what we're talking about. We're talking about people who may have some significant, meaningful Jewish affiliations, certainly, but are not, don't identify as Shomrei Torah Mitzvot. They're not halachically observant anymore, these kinds of things. We know that, and we're not surprised that it's happening at a higher rate in non-Orthodoxy than it is in communities to the right of non-Orthodoxy within the Jewish community. And it's also probably not surprising that it's happening less often than it is in communities that are, if you will, to the left of non-Orthodoxy and non-Orthodox, communities, in terms of upbringing, etc.
Mhm.
But that distinction between men and women is really interesting. What's really interesting is that we don't necessarily have data that there's a significant distinction in that regard in the right-wing Orthodox community, but we do now have some emerging data, it would appear at least, certainly that's happening in the non-Orthodox community, and now at least early indications that happening in the non-Orthodox community, perhaps as well, where there's a higher degree of disaffiliation. I think it might be happening to a lesser degree than in the non-Orthodox community, even from a percentage standpoint. There's a lot of different. What's really interesting, though, is talking with Professor Sylvia Barak-Fishman, who's talking about accomplished Jewish sociologists, right? But she's certainly been a standard bearer in the field for many, many decades. So around the time I was looking into this and some other related issues, I spoke with her. She made a really interesting observation. She wrote the kind of study, created this sense of masculinity crisis in the non-Orthodox Jewish community. In 2008, I believe it is, she writes a monograph and she asks basically like, what's going on with Jewish men? The exact title, men are, by every significant measure that we have available, men, in at least outside of the Orthodox community, are less engaged and affiliated in Jewish life than women across the. She says, I'm a card-carrying feminist. I believe in many of these ideals, that but that doesn't mean we can't, again, hold both these in our hand at the same time. So I was really curious about kind of the response to this and kind of where the non-Orthodox community kind of fits into it. She's, very much deeply connected with the non-Orthodox community, affiliated with it, and participates in the community. So she's like really curious. She has a very different take. She's not saying that it's kind of like all right and all's well. We've kind of arrived at this kind of uneasy place where kind of men have a certain role and still in many parts of the community as a kind of a more significant prominence, whether in ritual life or so on. But it's no longer so dramatic as to be excluding women to the nearly extent that it was previously. And there's kind of this like, if not perfect harmony, but kind of balance that's been struck that she think is, whether or not it makes her comfortable, whether she agrees with it, she likes it, whatever, her sense is the community is going to be okay, is not going to experience that same crisis. And she thinks there's a qualitative difference.
In addition to the many and plentiful resources that exist on jewishdrinking.com, whether it's secondary literature, fascinating insights, in addition to the really cool podcast, The Jewish Drinking Show, did you know that you can also provide interesting opportunities for your synagogue, JCC organization? And yes, that's me, bringing Rabbi Drew to help bring Lehrhaus to life, whether beer in the Bible, whether it's various Talmudic drinking stories, and more. I'm happy to chat, to talk to you, talk to your synagogue, your organization, your JCC, whatever it is. Feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com and see how we can bring Lehrhaus to life. I'm curious, are you planning on doing any more writing research or other involvements with regards to masculinity?
For sure. There's like so many projects. They're not all on the front burner right now. So nothing immediate. One relates to masculinity, but really goes to more general gender issues. Something I'm thinking about now. So on topics related to transgenderism, that also kind of related to this topic. And Yilbash, obviously, that was certainly more than related to the topic of my dissertation. And there's another one about the idea of Mechamta Shel Torah, that's coming back to masculinity, and this idea of seeing completely different tack now, but speaking about masculinity is closer to my dissertation from another perspective. But the rabbis perceive and project this image of the rabbinic students in the Beit Midrash as a warrior, that's right, armed with the Torah, engaged in this discourse that can be even lead to violence at times.
Rabbi Dr. Sinensky, this has been fascinating, insightful. Before we go, is there anything that you would like to promote?
Sure, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come on to talk. This is a great conversation. Really enjoyed it. For sure, as you kind of mentioned, involved in a whole bunch of different things. There's just a couple of things I'll mention quickly, some of which connect directly to Man Seder, some which don't. But number one, anyone who's interested in checking out the sermons of Rabbi Norman Lamm, who's the third president of Yeshiva University. So that's one project that I've been involved in the last number of years. He's got a website. You can just go and Google Rabbi Norman Lamm's sermons, and you'll find an incredible archive. Again, I see a way to sign up for the email list, just really week after week. We send out one sermon a week, really great material.
From something in his past?
From one sermon.
Wow.
We retype them so that you can either see his original handwriting or transcription with his little notes on the side, and the original copy, or you can get a typed up version, or you can compare them and do some manuscript work, whatever you want. But amazing, because so many of them were delivered 50, 60, even 70 years ago, and they could have been delivered today.
Wow.
That's really, really don't make sermons like they used to. And this is pretty incredible stuff. So that's one. If anyone's interested in, as you mentioned, my dissertation, to learn more about some of those, you can check out, either you can just Google Tzvi Sinensky dissertation, will come up right away. You can also look at my website.
I'll be linking to it in the show notes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that. And you can check out a bunch of my essays and articles at the Lehrhaus, and also on my blog, tzvisinensky.com. Check it out.
Awesome. All right. This has been great, fascinating, wonderful. And with that, I want to wish everybody l'chaim.
L'chaim.